ISO FileMaker Magazine, the professional's resource for FileMaker know-how.
Hey there, and welcome back to yet another FileMaker tutorial. This is Matt Petrowski bringing you these FileMaker tutorials from my website, FileMakerMagazine.com. As I covered in the previous video, if you have not seen this, seen the previous version of this two-part series, you're going to want to see that unless you're just wanting the nitty-gritty of DataTables. That's what I'm going to be covering in this video. And let's take a look and head over to my desktop, see what I'm talking about. All right, thanks for joining me here on my desktop. As you can see, we've got the file, and I'm going to be diving right into the guts of this file. Now, first and foremost, if you're watching this on YouTube or one of the other free places where I release my videos, all of this content is being provided for free, but part of the way that I make my living is I spend hours and hours creating sometimes these technique files and investigating and seeing how things can get implemented into FileMaker like DataTables. And unfortunately, this file, the one that I'm showing here on screen, is part of my subscriber or membership. I will say this, the information is free. I'm going to provide you with every detail here possible. But if you do consider subscribing, the cost of a subscription is so small that the number of hours that I took to develop this in terms of time savings is well worth the price of the subscription. It is very low in relative to all online training, and I've kept it that way by intention for many, many decades. But enough of that. Let's get into the details, what you're here for, the actual information. Okay. DataTables. That is what we're focusing on in this video. Everything else with regards to implementation I covered in the first video of this two-part series, and we are here to figure out how do we set this portal up so that I'm even calling them portals. How do we set this web viewer up that we're going to use to replace our portals or even maybe our list views and put things in like our buttons and have them call the right scripts and learn how to do things in JavaScript and learn DataTables. Yes, you do have to learn DataTables if you're going to use DataTables. DataTables, if you didn't know, is free to implement commercially in your FileMaker solution. It's licensed under the MIT. The documentation is your go-to source. And in the first video, I mentioned that you absolutely want to go through the examples. As you scroll through here, this side area, unless this changes after I've shot this video, going to the examples is what you want. But if you look at this just here, if you just simply look on their main page and go through and say, use almost any data source, DOM, JavaScript, AJAX, server-side processing. JavaScript is what we are going to be using. We're implementing the data directly into our web viewer as retrieved from FileMaker, or AJAX is one of our possible methods. Themes, how can we make it look the way that we want? You can do your own CSS, or you can use an existing framework, Bootstrap, etc. Editor, buttons, responsive. These are upsells. The editor is one of the things that they're selling. That's how they make money. Of course, pay the money if you're going to support this. I highly suggest it, especially if your solution is making money. But all of this is best covered through two things, the reference and then the examples. Examples is where you're going to be spending your time learning. Reference is where you're going to be going to get all of your details. Let's get this off to the side so I'm not blocking it, of your options, most importantly, your API, events, buttons, and types. These last three you don't really need as much as you do your options, and in particular your API, especially calling in and calling out, which I'm covering in this video. So enough of that. Let's get into the details. We're going to go through this step by step in the web viewer, or in the data that I have. Now there are two different examples that I have here. Number one, I am retrieving more data than I'm showing. As I click on this Show More button, you'll see that more columns are actually shown. This is a key aspect of implementing into FileMaker. Into FileMaker, you may always want to show the same data, but you also may only want to show a small subset and provide the user with a method to go see more data. Now, how they see more data is up to you. You can show more within the web viewer itself by revealing more columns, or you can take them to a completely different FileMaker layout with a different portal if you're using a portal, or a different web viewer. How and what you show in this, you have full control. I'll leave the examples for you to see to see what you're going to do, but we're going to be going through all of the details of what I implemented step by step. So in our data tables, everything is consolidated into the one step of insert text. It is where I have my JavaScript, my HTML, and my CSS, my own personal overrides. I've done this on purpose so that it's easy for you to understand how we've got everything collected in here. I am referencing the JavaScript and CSS provided externally using links. I explained in the first video in implementation. Go review that one. If you need to implement locally, you'll have to get it into the layout in text blocks, or you'll have to get it into fields into a dedicated table. When it comes to the JavaScript, or the CSS, excuse me, after you have chosen a particular method of how you want to style the table so that it looks like the rest of your FileMaker solution. In this one, I chose Bootstrap 4. There inevitably are going to be things that you want to override. So I am going to turn off this right here by using these quotes or these comments. CSS does not support inline comments. In other words, it does not support the double slash, but it does support block comments in order to comment something out. And I'll click OK, and then I will just run this script. Save that and run it. Now you can see that this is really big. Each of these rows is huge. I want these to be much smaller. If you have not worked with CSS and HTML, finding how to make modifications is going to be one of the biggest frustrations. So that's what we're going to cover right now. How do you find what is controlling the height of these rows? Well, this is where you're going to have to, unfortunately on Windows, it's a lot harder to open up some type of inspector or what they call the debugger. You're going to probably want to do this on the Macintosh, or you're going to need to find a way to get your data and do your debugging within a web viewer. How would you do that? Well, remember, in my script, I am shoving all of this content into a globally accessible variable. So if you do not have access to Safari, you're not on a Mac, and you're not able to do what I can do right here, right click and choose this option of inspect element, which does need to be turned on, by the way, which I will probably refer to an article in order to do that. You can go into your data viewer, take all of your HTML, which I just double clicked. I can copy all of this, put it into a text document, and then just go load it into a web viewer. In other words, I can copy this, put it into VS Code or Vim or whatever you use for your editor, save the file, open it in Chrome, and that's where you're going to have access to your debugging tools. It's a hassle. I'll admit, it is very much a hassle, but that's one of the reasons that I implemented here in Globals. So in order to find this, we have to use the inspector. Now, if you don't know how to turn this on, you're going to need to go to, I'm going to refer you to Beeswax. They're the first place that I saw how to do this, but just search Google for Web Viewer, FileMaker, Inspector, Web Inspector, and you will find the code that you need to put into a terminal in order to turn this on. Once we're here, what we can do is we can hover over everything. And let's see if we can see this off to the side. You can see that as I hover, everything becomes highlighted. This is how you're going to find or dive into the CSS, cascading style sheets. You have to go through the cascade to find ultimately what you're looking for. Now, what I'm looking for is I want to make this row. So as I hover, you can see what's blue, and then that's a header right there. I can see it's the T head. Now I get to this T body. That's all of the individual rows. Then I get to the TR, which is the table row. That might be the first place. I can see TD, but when we zoom out here, we can see that when I'm on the TD, it's just each individual column. So if you haven't worked with HTML before, TR is row, TD is just data. So think of R for row and D, which is basically our cells. So on this, I'm going to select this item, and when I select this, when I select any one of these, notice that this area over here, the styles, is changing. So I select on the TR because that's what I want to make smaller. So then what I'm looking for is I'm looking for an attribute. All of these different little attributes or these properties, in CSS I believe they're called properties, and on HTML, attributes are on tags. Terminology is always a bear with both of these. But basically, I'm looking for something that's showing me what is causing my cell to be higher. In this case, I happen to know that it's the padding. It's either one of two things, either padding or margin. So this is in reverse order. I mean, in other words, the highest item here is the last rule that wins. And a style attribute is something that is actually here that would be on the physical tag itself. In this case, you can see right here, this is a highlight of the table, and this is a physical style on the actual tag. This is the last and final rule. Anything before it is coming from CSS. So if you put a tag literally on the HTML in that field area in your FileMaker script, that is a final say. Also, if you have some CSS that comes after the CSS, that is also a final say, unless the CSS prior to it has what's known as an important tag. You'll see it's a little exclamation point with the word important, and that means that it's sort of taking precedence earlier in the chain. But here we have the reverse order of the chain. So as I scroll through this with my TR selected, and I do have it still selected, I'm looking for something that shows me that I have that TR, or that I have the height somewhere. And I keep going, I just keep scrolling until I find something that looks like I'm going to get to it. Am I going to get to it? Well, maybe it's not in the TR. Maybe it's on the TD. So we move down now. And actually, this now gives me a clue. Wait, when I'm hovered over the TR, notice that everything up here that we're looking at when we're hovered on this, everything is blue. There's nothing that's actually green or orange. But when I go on this one right here, I can see that green. Green, I believe, is indicating padding, and orange is indicating margin. I don't know if you can change those, but let's check this one out. We'll select the TD, and we'll go look at our style attributes, and we'll scroll down. Right there, there's padding. So in reverse order, the first time that I hit this is the padding, and I can see that it's on the .table TD and the .table TH. So table data, table header. I can also see where this is coming from. What is actually controlling this? Well, in this case, it's the DataTables CSS. Now, I can click on this. There's two ways that I can get this as an override. Number one, right here staring me in the face, I can just select and copy these. This is what I'm going to want to override. In other words, I want my overrides to come after the data tables, which is exactly what I'm going to do. So first, I can copy it from here, or I can select this, and when I click on this, it will load the actual CSS, and then I can copy this whole thing right here, which is what I tend to do. I just copy this, and now I just go right back over to my FileMaker, go into where I've got my CSS, and we can see that the loading order is this. Here is where the DataTables CSS is loading right here. DataTables min right there. As an override, if mine comes after that, such as right here, then it's going to override what was in this point. And you can see right here, I simply did this. I scrolled in, I pasted the content. I did not need to override the vertical, so I took that off. I did not need to override the border, and I took that off. I simply needed to override the padding. And in this case, you can see that the way that this works is if you provide one single value, it works for all of the values, the top, the right, the bottom, and the left. And the way that it works is it works in clockwise fashion. I think that would be clockwise for you. So it starts at the top, I believe, and then it goes to the right, and then it goes to the bottom, and then it goes to the left. So FileMaker works that way in its dialogue sometimes if you haven't noticed. So if you just do two values, that will be the two sides, and then it'll be the top and bottom, or it's the top and bottom and the two sides. Well, I was fine with the sides having that value of the 0.75, but I wanted the top to be smaller. So I simply, having copied that, said, well, I really don't need that to apply on the header. I want the header to have it on the top because that's where the little sort arrows are. So I just wanted it to apply to just the data cell. And that's how I found that particular setting and modified the styling from Bootstrap, or in this case, DataTables Bootstrap Supplementary CSS, and I took control over the look that I want. So this is the first lesson in making sure that you feel comfortable with how you can get the data that you've retrieved from FileMaker to look the way that you want within your actual portal. It doesn't matter what you want to override. You can become familiar with all of the different things. If you want to change a font, it's going to be font-family. If you want to change a font size, there's a font sizing. There is a font weight. All you have to do is spend a little bit of time and become familiar with some of the CSS properties, and you're good to go. You can see right here that I even have commented out. We're going to take a look at how you actually set a given row to be clickable. And if the row is not clickable, we don't want it to have the little hand cursor. But if it is, then we want to turn it on. And you can see right there, I've got that waiting for one of our upcoming examples. So I don't want to talky about overriding styles. I just showed you how you override styles. And that's what you have to use. You have to use a web inspector. It's either in Safari or you have to copy your HTML, go use Chrome, as I mentioned, or spend the time and figure out the hard way to use some type of debugger on IE. Moving on, we are now going to take a look at how do we get everything within our web viewer. How can we add some additional buttons? That's going to be the next thing that we're going to look at. All right, you want to add things to the web viewer, which this is just a giant web viewer. If you didn't know right here, it's the same thing that we have over here, just this is the small version that simulates a portal. This is just a large version that simulates a list view, which you could certainly do if you want to. What happens is you have to make a decision when you're going to use data tables. And typically the best decision is go for the minimal set of features in the actual web viewer, because it's much easier to add things in FileMaker. In FileMaker, you simply just add your buttons by simply just dragging out a button. It's there, you assign your script, you're done. We're talking about a few seconds. It's going to be a little bit more difficult until you become until you get really familiar with JavaScript, that adding things into the web viewer just isn't as comfortable. But when you are familiar and comfortable with JavaScript, it's really not that bad. So one of the things that I did, which we will turn on here in the demo file, is, and I love working in this insert text field because you just go in and it's just like an editor. The only thing I do need to point out is this does not validate, or it doesn't do any syntax checking or linting, meaning verifying that the code is actually legitimate code. FileMaker doesn't do that here in the insert text. So if you are doing a lot of complex JavaScript, I highly suggest that you use an external editor with a linter or something that's going to say, oh, this JavaScript that you typed isn't correct. For example, if this one quote was missed off, fortunately, I do have the monkey bread plugin that is actually causing the syntax highlighting to happen here in FileMaker, but the monkey bread plugin is in no way doing any type of, yes, this is valid JavaScript versus not valid JavaScript. So you have to be able to be familiar enough to know when you can catch your errors, or you have to use that external editor. So there is right here a nice little feature that if I turn off this HTML comment, and I'll go over here to turn off the other side, I have added some buttons with some features that you will not get in a portal. You do not get this in FileMaker, which is yet another reason to use data tables, which I love. Notice that I have added increase and decrease buttons. Now, I could not add these outside of this web viewer because they apply to the content in the web viewer. If I click decrease, notice that I can decrease the size of all of the content. Try to do that with a FileMaker portal. You can't. Or I can increase the size if, like me, I'm needing glasses and I'm getting harder of seeing. Now, if I want to show all of my columns and I now don't have enough column data, well, I can size that down. Well, let's take a look at that and break this one down. First off, in order to add any buttons into your web viewer, there's two ways that you can do it. You can hard code the buttons, or you can do it with JavaScript. The easiest way is just to hard code the buttons. You can see right here that I simply added a tag that is a button tag. Right there, there's the open, there's the close, and I named it decrease. and I named the other one increase. So they're both the same thing right here. I put some explicit styles on these. In other words, if something else is going to style them up above, bootstrap, what have you, I want to have the final say, and that is I want to have a margin on the right of 5 pixels so that the distance between this button and the one next to it, there's a little bit of space. Finally, I added some classes. Now, in order to get these buttons to do something, I'm going to have to run JavaScript. There's 2 ways that I can run a JavaScript, which will actually call a FileMaker script. I can write on an object. I can directly use an on-click attribute. Now, this thing that we have, so this is the tag, and this attribute right here can actually have a call or perform JavaScript directly itself. I can put an alert and say, with single quotes, because, well, I could put double quotes within here and it should work fine because I'm in a text field. But if I do an on-click alert right there, when I click this decrease button, I don't know if both of them would happen, but I have a direct JavaScript as a result of a attribute that will work, or down in the bottom in the JavaScript that I load, I have loaded or told this JavaScript, hey, if you come across a button and that button happens to have the class of adjust, then we're going to do something. We're going to pull that content out. When I pull the content out, I'm pulling out both of the classes of adjust and minus. If I happen to be pulling out a minus, that means I'm going to be going the opposite direction, -1 in font size. Otherwise, I'm going to go +1. And if you look at the other button right here that I have next to it, this one has, well, it's split over 2 lines, but let's just put a hard return right there and indent that. So you can see this one I'm saying adjust minus and adjust plus. Now, are these classes doing anything with regards to CSS? No, they're not. I'm using them for the purpose of programmatically being able to determine which button you clicked on. And I did that because if I use a value within the class, instead of the actual name of the button, which you can get, it's called content text, then this can be, you know, any other language. So whereas this is hidden. Anything you want to do anytime you're doing things on code, you want to do it based on code that is hidden, not code that is exposed, where it might be changed for the purpose of a language change. So I did not choose to do this. That was the first method. I didn't choose to use the onClick. I chose to use the method of adding a JavaScript. Well, let's scroll down. The JavaScript in this file is not a whole lot, and all of this part is basically everything right there is simply that's the declaration for the data tables. It's not a whole lot. But down here at the bottom, we get to some JavaScript, and let me get that centered on screen, where we are actually going to be doing certain things based on clicks or adding buttons, what have you. Well, here's the little JavaScript that I added, and we'll go over it really quickly because we're all about learning JavaScript and data tables in this. So this is a jQuery call. Remember, everything in data tables is based off of jQuery. jQuery uses a $sign in order to start off how you're going to identify what you're looking for. Well, I just explained what I created. I created a button. So in this case, I'm not even looking for a button. I could put right here, this even makes it more explicit. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm saying I want to look for a tag that is button with the class of adjust. So this right here is selecting both of those objects. It is selecting the decrease and the increase. And I'm saying on some type of event. That event happens to be a click. So if you click on one of these objects, then in this case, I'm not specifying this would be a further object, whatever the click is received. It could be, we'll see, it's actually up, I think, yeah, right here is where we're using it. Same right here. Here's an example of an on click, on the click of a particular object, in this case a table row, you would do something. So right here I didn't need to put anything because the object itself that I selected is the object that I want to get the click. So it will default to this one right here. And again, this right here, the distinction is if I just use the class name, in this example, I only have those two objects. It's very tightly controlled. But in a super complex page, you might have many more things that have the shared class of adjust. So if I wanted to be more explicit, then I would put, an object of not Veron, but button. On that click, I want you to run a function. This is what's known as an anonymous function. This function, I've got some debugging right here where I'm writing out to the console saying, what is the class of this? This, in this case, is going to be the button, and you can see that I'm using a function that says, does it have the class? So in this case, if you click on the minus version and I say, let the direction say this object, which is the button, if it has the class of minus, and this right here is what's known as a shorthand if. This is an if statement because of this question mark that says, if this, then my result is this, otherwise my result is this. So if it has the class of minus, using it for programmatic purposes, we're going to use a -1, otherwise we're going to use a +1. Then finally, I'm going to say, let the font size be equal to whatever it currently is. How do we get that? Well, we are going to parse the body CSS and use its font size. So while in the CSS I might have multiple objects with multiple sizes, I'm definitely going to use the whole of the body, parse it, and in this case I'm going to set a new font size to the font size plus the direction, either minus or positive, plus the pixels, and I'm going to then apply to everything. The star is usually a wildcard, meaning apply to everything. I want you to set the CSS font size to a font size +1, or in that case, the direction 1. So in this case, if you had varying sized objects, you then have to be a little more specific, but then in this case, most everything is pretty much all the same size. In fact, I believe it all is the same size. So this works in this implementation. It might not work if you've got a much more complex data table. So now that we've talked about that, we can go on to the next thing, which is the initialization and our options for the data table. And we'll simply just look at those one for one. What are the features that are and how they work? So let's go ahead and do that. All right, so this is going to be, I'm going to try to make this a pretty quick walkthrough because I'm explaining a lot of the technical aspects of the CSS, HTML, how it interacts with the JavaScript, and how you do those, how you use those things, because those are going to be the most frustrating. When it comes to the features, you can look at the documentation that DataTables provides. I'm just going to walk through the features that I put in, which at a minimal are basically, things that I think you would want, such as being able to reorder columns. Try this in a portal. You cannot do this. I want my button in the front, and I need to see the company at the very beginning. And yeah, that's city, state, that's good. And I want to be able to sort, let's sort based on the state. Let's sort everybody's by last name so that I've got that in order. It's just so awesome. These are all of the different options that you have, and let's go one for one through them. So we'll open this up and break them down side by side so that we can see what we've got. So first off, we have to have in our HTML an object where the data that we've retrieved from FileMaker that we replaced into this variable using just a simple substitute, we have to have some place for that to go. That is right here. You can see that we have an empty table tag. We do not have any table rows, which would be a TR, if I could type here, table row with a closing table row tag, and then within that we would have our TD tag with a closing TD tag. We do not have that. So this, remember, DataTables supports all different methods. You can put your FileMaker data formatted into a table format. You can use FileMaker's execute SQL, and you can get that SQL back, and you can get that SQL to wrap automatically into a fixed HTML structure. Takes a lot more effort, not worth it. We can just grab the JSON out of FileMaker's API or generate it with those globals. So we really only need just the table placeholder. Now on this placeholder, we have to have some type of class. Whatever CSS framework you choose, it will use different named class tags. So in this case, table and table striped are very specific to Bootstrap. If you pick Foundation or Bulma or some other framework, these will have to be different. So that's one point of frustration that you need to be aware of. Now, I need to identify or target this table based on a known attribute. That's where we have the ID for this table set to table. I just named it the same thing. What does it matter? It's just one table. It's in a web viewer. I could have named this whatever I want. This can be literally anything. But if you're going to put anything, you have to target anything. So right here, when we have this function, this is jQuery saying when the document, the whole of the HTML is finally ready, meaning it's been rendered, all of the HTML, we're going to run a function, and within that function, we're going to do something. That thing we're going to do is we are going to create a variable called table, which is going to, on the object of it, this case is called anything, so I would have to match this to anything now. Everything has to match in JavaScript and CSS HTML. Otherwise, one thing calls something and doesn't know it. It's like walking up to a person, her name is Mary, and you say, "Hey, June," and she's like, "My name's not June." You have to call the right person the right name. Same thing in JavaScript and HTML. You have to call things the right name. So you call it table, call it table. So there we go. So my table with the ID of table is going to use jQuery to say, hey, ID with table, we are going to create a data table out of you. Where's the data? The data we're going to use is our FileMaker supply data. We already saw that in the first video, how to go retrieve it. We've got it in the format we want, either a native format or a non-native format. Now, we have some columns. Up at the top of those columns, we have a title, and that title is going to be what is the column of that particular object. You can see that this one never shows. So we are intentionally hiding this first object. Now there's two ways to do that. This is a JSON object, and we can put the visibility direct on this object. I can say right here, add another one and say visible. Actually, I need that in quotes. Visible, and then I put a colon, and I'm going to type false. Now, I've already done that in one other place, but in this case, we need the ID. You have to have the ID or whatever the primary key is, otherwise you're not going to be able to do anything within the table in relation to that particular row out in the rest of FileMaker. With the ID, which is golden, you can then do anything, and we will be able to extract that ID when we do something in FileMaker, when we do something in the data table, when we click. Now, an alternative way of making this particular field invisible or other fields is to use this other setting of column defs. So column defs, you can see right here, you can create any number of objects, and those objects specify targets. So in this case, the targets are just simply each of the rows. So in this case, this is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So you can see I've got 0 is going to be visible because I've set visible to false on these targets. So this is invisible, this will show, this will show, this is going to be invisible, this row. This will show, no, that one's invisible, and then this one's invisible right there. I did that for the purpose of being able to show you, you can bring data in, show a smaller subset, but then give user the ability from FileMaker to actually say, I want to show those things. And we'll take a look at that when we look at the button in order to do that. We can also completely, this is how we add our own buttons. So here you can see I've got another object, but in this particular case, what I'm saying is I've got a target, and it is a row number 7. There is no row 7 in the data that I'm retrieving. But what we're going to do is we're going to create a row 7. We're going to set the data to nothing, but we are going to set default content on this. We're also going to turn off the sorting for this column. It doesn't make sense to sort a column that is a button. So it is not orderable, which you'd hope that they use the word sortable, but they probably used it somewhere else. It cannot be ordered, so it is set to false. Our default content is, and if we make this much larger so that we can see it, a button. So this is how I'm getting my button on a row by row basis. You append a column with no data with whatever you want as default content. And I'm creating a button with the ID of view. Knowing that, and what I just showed you about writing a JavaScript, I can now write a JavaScript that's going to run a FileMaker perform script, which will perform my FileMaker script based on any of these items. I can look at the class attributes by setting one on there, or I can simply just set an ID, which is the easiest way to go, because then you're going to be looking for a button tag with the specific ID of view. So if I wanted another button on here, what would I do? Well, I would just add another target right here. It would just basically copy this whole row. Targets 8, data null, and then my button with an ID of maybe edit. And I would add a new button. And of course, making that button look however you want is completely controlled by CSS and the styling. Make it smaller, make it bigger, make it use an icon, make it use an SVG if you want. You can make it look however you want it to look. Super, super awesome stuff. In this case, I've got some classes that match the Bootstrap classes in order to make the button small, primary, and the fact that it is a button, and this is how Bootstrap knows how to style it. So that's how we added on this button that you see right here. Next up, do we want to allow the user to be able to drag these columns? That's right there. Column reorder, enable true. Now remember, this is an extension that had to be added on to the core of DataTables. So if you go out and get the JavaScript that is just the core of DataTables and you don't include the column reorder, doesn't matter if you add this, it won't work. Same thing with fixed header. If you want to be able to have a fixed header, meaning when I scroll this data, the header that we see right here of the first name, last name, etc., it then locks at the top, which is the same thing as having field headers outside of your portal. We do want that right there. Here is our default order. Do you want to support an initial default order with a multiple column sorts where you're simply just going to specify it's an array of arrays? You're simply going to add another one of these. It would be like comma this. Well, what columns do you want to sort on? Well, I want to sort on the city. That's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, I would sort here based on 4. I could go descending here if I wanted to, and then ascending on something else. It's whatever you want. You control the multi-column order sort, and then the user can start to click on those columns. Gosh, you just can't do that with a portal. This is so awesome. Finally, do you want to show the info? Well, in this case, I'll turn these on true, and I'll turn on paging to true. Now, in most cases, you will always want to turn paging off. Because we're using this within FileMaker, we're going out, retrieving our data, and bringing it back. If you reflect on the previous video, I believe that's where I mentioned it, you almost will never want to go get 100,000 records and then come back and display 100,000 records in a portal. Although I will say this, JavaScript will handle it infinitely faster than a FileMaker portal ever would. So even if you were transferring data back of 100,000 records of 3 fields only, it'll be pretty stinking fast. But if we turn these on, which are on by default, we will be able to see what DataTables normally looks like. I mean, you can look at the examples, but it basically has the little thing up in the corner where you can see 10, 25, or 50 records. We don't want to see that. We just want to see all of our data and have the web viewer scroll itself. And the paging, we don't want to see the pager down at the bottom where you've got page 1, 2, 3, 4. You typically want that off. So I'll probably cancel this and just leave it up to you and the examples to know that you can turn those on. So that's pretty much, this is what I would call a standard FileMaker DataTables setup. Doing the things that we have right here, turning off the false. You can show that outside of, well, you might want to show that in the portal depending on how many records you're getting, but you can also show it using a field if you have a relationship already in your relationship graph to show those as well. So the last thing that we're going to look at is how do we hook up our button to, when you click, to calling a FileMaker script, and then how do we call into the data, into the web viewer, into DataTables to get it to do things. And those are going to be pretty simple, straightforward. And I'm going to show you where you look, where you find more information in order to do that. All right, we're on the home stretch. Long videos, I know, but I wanted to cover everything. They give away DataTables for free for commercial use. So I wanted to do the same thing with this information in terms of how you can use it within FileMaker. So we just want to hook up buttons now. What happens when we want to hover over each row and make that clickable, or do we want to have a button that's clickable? And when we click that button, we want it to do something, such as call a FileMaker script, which brings up a card window and allows us to edit that data or do whatever we want or go to another layout, whatever it is that you want the FileMaker script to do. These are super easy. Once you understand what we've already seen with the increase and decrease of how you target a given object, we simply just add an event that's going to happen on that particular event. Now, the on event within jQuery, it's unlimited what you could do. I could have something happening in FileMaker every time that I'm hovering over a row, or every time that I hover specifically over a specific field, or I could put a slider in here, or any of the myriad of things that are available in HTML. You could do anything. It's almost limitless. The number of events that you have access to within a web viewer is just mind-boggling. But if we go in here, we simply need to know what is it that we're specifically targeting and what do we want it to do. So since we added this object right here on each row, we need to create a companion function that's going to run our FileMaker script. And we can see down here that we've got the same thing that we did right here, where we target our button.adjust with the class saying on click. Well, in this case, we're simply targeting the same thing. In this case, we are going to target our table with the ID of table. We're going to target the body part, not the header part, and we're going to target a particular target row. Now, what happens is this means it's going to grab the whole row. We need the whole row because the row has all of the data within it. But for the click itself, we need to target just specifically the button. So you can see right here that we're saying on a particular event of a click, the object within that row that we want to target is the button object where we have given it the ID of view. This is what specifically targets that button and that button only. So now, out of all of the data that we have, we need to get something. The grabbing of that thing is right here where we are creating a variable called ID. Now, this is why we have to have the primary key. The primary key now, we can say, we know that we have created an object called table. We did that all the way up here where we said, create a variable called table. Well, jQuery is going to be able to see that table, and DataTables riding on top of jQuery, or within jQuery, I guess, is going to actually grab the associated data that goes with that table out. So right here, we're going to see on that table, we want to get a row. What row is it? It's going to be this, the parent of this, and we're going to look at that data, and we are going to get the first item. What is the first item? It's the ID that we're supplying that also happens to be hidden, which you'll see when we look at the other method of getting the data out will be a different way of referring to it. So here's the thing that I'm trying to point out that's super, super important. The way that you get your data is the way that you have to refer to your data. In this method that I'm showing you throughout this video, the way that I'm getting the data is I'm running a replace. That replace is going across each record and compiling into a global field a JavaScript or a JSON array and then putting that into a massive array. So I have an array of little arrays of data. That's different than the data when I go use FileMaker's data API and I go grab that. The result of a data via the data API, the result of the JSON that comes back is actually an array of curly brace objects. So that data is different than the way that I'm supplying data in the replace. This is the number one thing that will cause your frustration is if you get data one way, but you refer to it in another way by simply just copying code off of the net if you don't understand JavaScript. I'm trying to help solve the problem so that you're not frustrated. In this scenario, we see that when I want to reference the ID, I'm referencing the ID as the first column of an array, which is going to be much different than when we see the other method of using the data API. And then finally, here's the easy part. We simply just call the function that FileMaker, the web viewer, puts onto the window object by default. FileMaker, perform this script. What script? Well, it's going to be this view, or the script named view, and we're going to pass the ID. With that in as an inbound parameter, you're going to be good to go to run whatever you want to do. Now, would I do this in an actual FileMaker database? I would not do this. I do not reference hard-coded static values, because what happens is, as soon as I change the name of this script, if I go over here and change this script to now be called something like from views to views, I just broke my code. So what I do is in my actual FileMaker databases, and it's beyond the scope of this video because we're already so long, I use objects, or there are object scripts. Jeremy Bonte has them at his repository. Search the FileMaker magazine talking about referencing objects, layout objects, table objects, script objects. Internal, underneath the scenes, FileMaker gave this script an ID, a number. You are able to get that number using FileMaker's design functions. You are then able to translate that number into the name, the current name of the script, and that's what I would use within the content of my actual JavaScript. I would convert that to an actual value. So my substitution here, where I'm simply substituting just the data, I would use a placeholder for the name of each FileMaker script that I use as well, such that when I'm developing, when I change the names of scripts, they don't impact my content. If that doesn't make sense or you can't get into that, you're going to have to go reference using objects within FileMaker, because it is very, very important that you have created a fragile bit of code by simply directly referencing or hard coding a value such as a script name. So this would actually be a replacement value for me, which would be like, it might even be something like, the way that I would probably do it might be a variable that would be like script, it would look like this, script 56, which becomes very nondescript in here, but I will document that in the beginning of at the very top of my script with a comment step that says script 56 is the script currently named view. And then if it gets renamed, who cares? Because this dynamically updates and everything works out kosher. But I needed you to be able to understand this, and so I did it just the simple way of putting in the hard-coded value. I definitely wanted to be comprehensive and make sure that you know that this is not how we would do it. But this is what calls our script. So the view button is now hooked up. We call our script view and do whatever we want there. So now let's take a look at if we were to turn every row and see how simple that is. Well, that's just going to be a simple matter of me going like this. We'll go in here. So for the table body, in order to display the cursor, we change our CSS. I'll just uncomment this right here. So now it's going to show as a cursor when I hover over each row. It won't be the arrow that we see right there now in the center there. It will be the hand. And we'll scroll down, and I already have the code right here. So in this case, we take the comments off right here, and we can see that we have our table within our table body on the click of the actual TR. Notice the difference. Here I was referencing the table row and saying on the click of the button object. Here I'm saying within the table body on the click of the TR. It's very specific. We are going to reference the data here, and we are going to perform the script of view. Notice again, because of how this is formatted, where we click and we get the, we're going to the button view, there's a distinction between this and then this parent. And I believe I could have done, this might have been the same, just doing this right here. But there is a difference here by having to use the parent getting data versus getting the data of this. What is this? Well, in this case, this is the table row. Or actually, table row is getting this passed in. That's a confusion point. You have to play with this and know whether you need to go up a level or stay at the level you're at depending on what you're using as your selector, as they are called. I'll go ahead and use this, keep this the same just in case. Probably jQuery method would have been fine. Save the script, run the script, and now you see when I hover over each row, as I hover, when I click, there we go. I get my edit, and I get exactly what I want. So the only thing that I need to cover, which this is now probably, this video alone, just going through data tables is probably more than an hour. We need to cover in the differences of the data. I was very explicit about how you need to be able to get the differences in the data. We're going to take a look at that. Then we're going to look at calling inbound, referencing the API, and then wrap this video up. All right, super important. As I stated, the way that you get the data has to match how you reference the data, both when you're calling the scripts and referencing the selectors. Right here, we have the 3 steps that use the other method. I'm going to uncomment those within here, and we're going to look at the difference. There's only 2 areas where it's different. We'll double click, and as opposed to what we've been looking at, everything is going to be the same. We're simply swapping in our data, but remember, our data now is coming from the data API. The data API doesn't return it the same way that I'm formatting it using the replace field. In this case, you can see that it's much more complex, or not complex, it's just a little bit step farther. So where we have our title, what's going to be at the column, we can see that we've got first name, last name. You don't want it to say email, you want it to say email address, just type in email address. There you go, the change is that easy. But we have to reference the data the way that the data API is handing it back. And FileMaker's data API has a object named field data. Within that object are all of the pieces of information that are all of the fields. So all I have to do is I have to add on this thing that qualifies. I'm handing you data tables, but I have to tell you it's not in the expected format that you normally rely on, which is an array of arrays. It is now in this specific format. This format is FileMaker's format, and FileMaker formats it by putting it in field data, and then you will find the data for the ID column in the ID table. And just like it is here, first name is going to be referenced in the field data of the first name field, and there it is right there as returned from the data API. So this is where it's super important. If you use the data API, you have to change how you reference the data in order for data tables to actually format the data properly. Further on, if you're going to then reference that data for the purpose of a script, notice that what we just saw, where formerly we were referring to that data in the format of, oh, it's column 0, which is the ID that I want. Well, no. We don't want that in that format for calling the script because that's not the format that the data came in. The data came in where we were referencing the field data ID. So you have to change the way that you reference the data in the same way that the data is formatted. Super important, otherwise you will be frustrated. But now that you know, that's the only 2 changes you need to make. Get the data however you want to get the data, replace or via FileMaker's data API, add in whatever buttons you want, identify those buttons by an ID that uniquely identifies them, then set up your click such that it will uniquely identify that particular object and then perform whatever script you want. And that is the essence of getting your clickable objects within your data tables and getting your data there. Everything else is basically how do you want data tables to interact. And finally, the last thing that we're going to talk about here is going to be how do you call into data tables and get it to do what you want it to do. All right, finally, home stretch. We're there, and hopefully this information has been super helpful in terms of you becoming more comfortable with JavaScript and being able to get the results that you want, because the benefits of this are just, I had to shoot this extended video so that you can see how powerful it is, because I'm loving using these types of tools. So in the scripts, we've got the view script. That's the script that's being called. It's really no big deal. We say if there is a no script parameter, there's no point in continuing on because we don't have an ID. We expect one. I could do further validation. I would suggest that you make sure that it is a UUID, which usually has a pretty good fixed length. But super simple. We're creating a new card window. We're doing it in a particular layout. You could use go to related records, do anything FileMaker. I'm entering into find mode and just simply setting my ID and then bringing up that record. Then the user can edit the data. There is a disconnect in my implementation where the web viewer does not update the data tables, but it is possible. Trust me, it's possible. I just didn't want to make this a 5-hour video series. So how do we call into data tables, and how do we know what we can tell data tables to do? Number one, we can tell data tables to do anything. Anything. And it can do a ton of stuff. Once you go through the documentation, you will be shocked. I will leave you with one parting little thing. We'll go over to look at the examples, and you'll just be like, oh my gosh, I can make my FileMaker data is going to become more of just a data repository, and I'm going to be using JSON, web viewers, and JavaScript in order to do a lot of my UI. Here is how easy it is to call into the data table. We're using FileMaker 19's new Perform JavaScript in Web Viewer. We target the web viewer, and we simply just call a function the same way that we saw our JavaScript functions. So look at this. We don't even have to pass in any parameters. We simply just have to know how to target the right object. We've already learned how to target the right object looking at previous JavaScript, and here it is. We simply use jQuery. We target the table, that is the ID of the instance of the table. Data table is how we access the API, and then from there, anything that we want to do. And in this case, I'm using the columns. I'm passing in an array of the number of columns that I want to make visible. Note that I didn't want to make 0, but if I do, if you want to play around, go ahead and turn on 0 right there on the sample file. We are going to set its visible attribute to true for all of those columns. And guess what? This is now going to show me my ID within data columns where normally we would hide it. And this is what makes a lot of sense. So calling into the API, this reset column order, you can see right here, it's going to be the exact same thing at the beginning, but in this case, I'm just calling the call reorder function, and I'm telling it to reset. So if the user reorders things around on the column, I'm just calling back into the web viewer and telling it, hey, I want you to reset that. So watch this. My function now, show more. There's my ID right there. Data table simply wasn't showing it, but it's been there the whole time. And we could sort on it, do whatever. I reorder my columns. If I put this first, I put my ID at the end, I drag my button column over here. I need to reset those. I'm going to call into the web viewer, tell data tables, reset that. Everything goes right back to normal. Where do you find out what you can do? Documentation. You go to the documentation, scroll to your reference, go to your API for your reference, and here is where they even have a search window, probably using their own API, for all of the different things you can do. Scrolling, search builders, the filtering, what you can do is just phenomenal. And there's just a long, long list of all the stuff that you can do to affect rows, columns, cells, the whole table, add buttons, remove buttons, do whatever you want. This is going to be my wrap up, and let me show you one of the most complex examples when we go over to their examples and we look at this one right here. It's under the API section, and we go to the high charts integration. And what we have is we have a chart that pops up that when you hover over it shows you a bunch of different things, but yet this chart dynamically updates based on things that you do to the data table. So we search our data table for Tokyo, and look, it not only filters Tokyo, but it then references and correspondingly updates the graph real time. FileMaker can't do this, ladies and gentlemen, but you can do this within a web viewer. And now that it is so easy to go in and out of FileMaker, and I've given you the two most easiest ways to get your data in a format that data tables can use right like that, stepping into this type of exploration of integrating a charting package and putting that all within one web viewer and giving your users even that much more power, that is the reason that I'm making these videos, for you to understand more about what you can do within FileMaker. So as always, I hope through this series you've learned a lot more. I'm sorry that it took so long, but I definitely wanted to cover every detail so that if you watch this from start to finish, you will be comfortable with being able to troubleshoot the little things that crop up that make it so frustrating to do JavaScript in conjunction with your data and use those two together. So much luck, and until next time, happy FileMaking.
We hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial, and we'd like to say thank you for your subscription and your support. If you're not already a subscriber, head on over to www.filemakermagazine.com/subscribe for more information about the benefits of joining.